Hey guys, and welcome to Irish Ham Radio, or welcome back to Irish Ham Radio if you've been here before. My name is Dave, call sign EI5IMB, and in this video, the first of a new series called Ham Radio Basics, I'm simply going to describe what is amateur radio, aka ham radio. So before I start, I'd just like to say that the descriptions that I use are from my own research and with my own opinions of what I believe the hobby is and some general consensus around research on what the belief the hobby is. I absolutely would love to hear your comments down below and some discussion on what you believe the hobby is best described as. Okay, so in summary guys, amateur radio, aka ham radio, is a hobby and a volunteer public service that brings people, electronics and communications together. Ham radio is the use of radio to talk across town, to talk across the world, or even into space. And with the exception of some of the newer digital modes, this is almost always achieved without the use of the internet or mobile phones. Hobbyists must pass an exam for a license to transmit or talk on the radio frequencies known as the amateur bands, but anybody is permitted to receive or listen with the right equipment. These bands are sections of radio frequency allocated by your National Communications Regulator, specifically for ham radio use. The volunteer public service element of the hobby is to provide emergency communications when required to any critical agencies or groups that are in need at the time. According to the ARRL, amateur radio is the only hobby that is governed by an international treaty. Alright, so you're probably thinking to yourself, right, it's basically a fancy way of saying that you use really expensive equipment or walkie-talkie radios to talk to people around the world. Why bother when you have instant access to the whole world in the palm of your hand on your mobile phone? Well, to answer that question, we have to look at why people get involved in the hobby. Although people get involved for many different reasons, they usually all share an interest in science and technology and either want to expand their current knowledge of or learn new things about radio technology and radio operating principles. Operators range from those who attain the basic knowledge required and then purchase all off-the-shelf equipment to operate, to those who learn how to build their own radios and their antennas from scratch. How deep you want to get into this hobby is totally up to yourself, and that's one of the great things about it. It's a fun social hobby as well as being an educational STEM field to be around, which I personally believe is a really good thing to be demonstrating to your kids if you're in that situation. Even if they laugh at it now, I do believe that many of the things a parent or a mentor demonstrates to a child are often reflected by that child later in their life. So I think I've touched on some of the reasons why people get into the ham radio hobby, but what keeps people interested and what would attract somebody who's maybe not so sure about getting into it? Well, amateur radio can be done almost anywhere, at your home, in your car, on a beach, or even on a mountain. Operators often combine their other interests with ham radio, such as travel by operating on different islands, for example, which is a recognised award scheme called IOTA, or Islands on the Air. It's also commonly combined with mountaineering, operating from mountain summits, which is also a recognised award scheme called SOTA, or Summits on the Air. And if you watched any of my videos, you'll see that that's one of the things that I'm really into particularly. One of the coolest things though is the presence of amateur radio in space. There are a number of satellites orbiting Earth through which you can bounce a signal and have a short conversation with somebody else if they do the same and bounce their signal back to you. This is also true of the International Space Station, whereby the radio gear on there can run in 3 different modes. The first mode is repeater mode, which basically is the same as the satellites that I've already just mentioned, and sometimes it's used for voice communication and sometimes it's used for data communication. The second mode is SSTV, or slow scan TV mode, which is the sending of images that can be decoded on the ground with a basic radio and some free PC software. And you don't even need a license to do that one whenever the International Space Station is in that mode. As long as you have a radio and an antenna that can receive and you have a PC, you can even be decoding pictures that have been sent from the International Space Station. And the coolest and rarest mode, which has been actually able to have a one-to-one conversation with an astronaut on board. This mode is mostly pre-arranged for schools or educational institutions, as the astronaut's time is so valuable. But sometimes, if you're lucky and an astronaut has some spare time, they may come onto the radio looking for a chat when the ISS happens to be overhead. So just to give you a few more other interesting aspects of the hobby, there's a common link with aviation. Many operators are pilots or have an interest in aviation and space, as highlighted by the presence of ham radio on the International Space Station, as well as many of the astronauts up there actually being licensed amateur radio operators. There's a common link with preppers, or people who actively prepare to be self-sufficient in case of a catastrophic event or disaster. This is due to the standalone communications ability of ham radio to operate without any commercial communications infrastructure at all. Competing in international competitions where operators try to get as many contacts as they can in a specific amount of time is another aspect of it. And finally, providing communications at times of emergencies. The most famous instance of this is likely during the 9/11 attacks in the United States, when amateur radio operators helped relay messages between individuals and family members when mobile phone networks were totally overwhelmed at the time. So to sum up and conclude, ham radio, in my opinion, is a very interesting hobby with many ways of getting into it at many different levels. Operators come from all walks of life and are of all different ages. It allows international communications and communications without the need for any commercial infrastructure. It's carried out in many forms in all sorts of locations, bouncing signals through space, talking to somebody thousands of miles away, and even using Morse code, which still has a large dedicated following and user base internationally in the hobby. So ham radio will have slightly different meaning to each individual involved in it, depending on where your interests lie initially and depending on how your interests develop. But I hope to those of you that are not so familiar with it that this video has helped you understand even just a little bit better what our wonderful hobby is about and some of the reasons why we do it. Who knows, maybe this has sparked some interest in some of you watching to look into the hobby, and if so, I really hope you do get into it, and I'd love to hear you on the air soon. Anyway, that's it from me. As I said, I'm Dave, call sign EI5IMB, and until the next time, as we say in radio, 7 3s.